62 suspected immigration offenders arrested. There were studies of local areas where people protested. You can't believe government statistics on immigration. Their campaign is to cause anxiety within the nation.
So I'm going to just talk you through a little bit about some of the research that we've done, tell you the background, in case you're not familiar with that, some of the methods we've used and who was involved, and then Kirsten and I will talk you through some of our key findings that you've got in the report. So I'm sure everyone here has seen this image before. In July and August 2013, the Home Office in the UK began this kind of very public campaign. Ostensibly, they said to encourage people without regular migration status to take voluntary returns and come forward and admit to the Home Office that they didn't have a right to be here and to leave. They used this van that had a slogan, "Go home or face arrest," and it drove around parts of London for a few days, but diverse parts of London, with a phone number and a text that you could call or text asking to be helped to go home. This was called Operation Bacon, and it was defended by the Home Office, but it caused a lot of controversy in news media among local communities, and several people, including the research team, were outraged by this and began to talk about how we could counter it with tweeting and complaining, and then we thought, what can we actually do as researchers? So it wasn't just this ban. Around the same time, there were also posters in reporting centres in Glasgow and in London, and these were less visible. These were signs that only people who were asylum seekers and migrants who were going to report to the Home Office would see, but they were really intense posters which were on the walls, pictures of destitute people saying, "Is life here hard? Going home is simple." There were stickers on chairs, there were stickers on the floor where you put your feet. There were even cardboard cutouts of aeroplanes hanging from the ceiling, saying, "We can book your tickets, you can get on this plane." These pictures only came to light to the wider public because of brave people in the migration reporting centres bringing out the pictures and sharing them with organisations like Migrant Voice. More public campaigns also at the same time was the UK Home Office Twitter account tweeting images of people being arrested on immigration raids and putting vans with these hashtags like immigration offenders, which were really about showing how tough and how every day this kind of militarised intervention was. So we wanted to know what are the effects of this. They're not just, the Home Office said that they're about trying to encourage people to come forward to the Home Office and admit if they're don't have regular migration status. But as researchers and activists and other people we were working with, we knew that this was going to have effects more widely on the community. So we brought together a team of academic researchers and working with a lot of other organisations. So this is the group of investigators on the project. So you can see there's 8 of us, and we're all going to be having different roles during today. I was kind of the bossy organising person who was in charge. But everyone's been doing important research, and we'll be talking about that today. And as you can see, we're from a range of universities, including Warwick. We also, right from the beginning, were working with partners nationally and locally, and that includes the organisations you can see up there who have been supporting us to share our information or who've been doing the research with us and alongside us and talking to us about how to shape that and what are the important things to find out and who to work with. So our fieldwork to try and find out what the effects of these campaigns on society more broadly has been in 6 local areas as well as nationally. So the local areas were in Barking, Dagenham in East London, Ealing and Hounslow in West London, Bradford, Cardiff, Glasgow, and the West Midlands, which expanded from Birmingham to include some work in Coventry as well. And in each of those areas, we worked with a local organisation who was involved in migrant rights or race equality, and with them conducted a focus group or more than one focus group in each place with different variety of people, migrants and non-migrants, people who were affected by enforcement raids and people who were worried about immigration intervening in their lives. So we had 67 people in those focus groups in total. We also interviewed activists in each place, so a total of 24 activists, about how this was affecting their work in organising around migration issues, and interviewed 9 policymakers nationally, so people involved in the Westminster kind of organisations who were who knew something about how this campaign was put together. We didn't just do that kind of local work and then go away. We also wanted to make sure it was an ongoing process of engagement. So in each of the areas we went back after we'd done our interim findings and had a local feedback meeting where we asked people, we said, this is what we found out so far, a lot of which is in the final report, but we also asked people to tell us what they thought of that and provoke more conversations, and then we've used that to inform our final report. We tried to look at online debates. As you saw, there was a lot of Twitter and social media engagement from the Home Office, but also from, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the presentation, from activist organisations, and we wanted to see how that worked in terms of different kinds of organising and effects of these kind of debates. And the final national piece of work we did was also to survey, commission a survey of 2,400 people through Ipsos Mori. So we designed questions there which we tried to shape around some of the things that were coming out of the interviews and focus groups we were doing, and tried to ask people across the board how these the kind of reactions people were having to the kinds of enforcement rates that were going on, and we'll talk a little bit about what we found. So on to the findings very quickly. I've not got much time. You've got this in your reports. We found no evidence that government communications about immigration and enforcement were based on research about what works in managing migration. Admittedly, it was hard to get into the Home Office to get anyone to talk to us about why they did these kind of interventions. But there was no nothing was produced anywhere that we could find about this being an effective thing about managing migration. The research we did find they were using around this was research done by a series of mainly by commercial research organisations, which seems to show that if you tell people, you try to have a rational argument with people about immigration, talk about facts, the public don't believe it. So this is a quote from one of the policy interviews that Will did. The government and public debate is always about how you can't believe the statistics on immigration. And so the policy understandings in Westminster now are that there isn't any point having that argument. What you need to, and so they're following a line that what needs to be shown is how tough the immigration enforcement regime is. So whether or not that enforcement regime works, is effective, or whether showing toughness is effective, that's what seemed to reassure the public. So that's what the research was that seemed to be being used. This is just a quick figure from our the national survey that Maury did for us. Not many people were aware of the ban a year later. Only 24% of people we interviewed through that survey were still aware of the go home ban a year in. But of those that were, nearly 35% said knowing about that, the go home ban in particular, made them more concerned that people are being treated unfairly. So that was quite a lot more than the people who were reassured that the government's taking action against irregular immigration. So even if the tough stance is about showing people that tough measures are being taken, you don't need to worry about immigration, it actually, those kind of really in-your-face measures were making people more concerned that this was unfair than anyone could be reassured. And we also found 15% of people, and this was for more or less all the measures we asked, 15% of people said, knowing about the ban, knowing about the more visible enforcement vans that actually do go out and do arrests, which now have signs on the side saying Home Office Immigration Enforcement rather than just being blank vans, as they used to be. Whether it was the signs in NHS premises saying the NHS isn't free for everyone. All of those things made around 15% of people said that made them more concerned that irregular or illegal immigration might be more widespread. So it was this effect of also increasing underlying worry that if you're doing that, then there must be a problem. Interestingly, a higher proportion, I've not got this on the slide, but a higher proportion of white people in the survey, so 28% of white people, 22% of people identified as ethnic minority were aware of the go home ban. So significantly more white people were aware of that go home or face arrest ban. But more black and minority ethnic people, 23%, than white people, 16%, were aware of the Home Office enforcement ban. So that branded van that actually goes and does something and arrests people and puts them in the back of a van and now says that on the side so you can see them driving around, was something that was much more in the awareness of black and minority ethnic people than white people. So that's an interesting kind of thing about what resonates with people, whether it's the kind of in-your-face advertising or the thing that might come and put you in the back of a van. So that moves on to our second finding, which was that we really found that these government campaigns provoked and increased anger and fear, and that was across the board. So it was among people who were worried about immigration in the first place too. He said, you know, this is a quote from a focus group in Bath and Dagenham that Yasmin did, talking about, okay, we see these things, we see these pictures of people being put in vans, but it's just theatre. So even there, this kind of toughness wasn't reassuring the public that immigration was not a problem. And we found many more stories, because of who we talked to, of the ways that this was making people feel really insecure, whatever their migration status and whether they were migrants or not. That being told to go home was making people feel like that was something that might have been consigned to history maybe, but was now really much more common and seemed to be condoned by the government to be under suspicion. So participants made direct links between those images, so that the ones in the Twitter campaign of people being put in back of vans, we showed them to people in focus groups and said, what do you think of these? And that really brought out people's experiences of their own encounters with that, whether it was being put in a van themselves or the fear of it, but also being out in the street and seeing the really visible raids in some areas of the country. So people weren't just saying, okay, that's directed at other people who need to be scared. It was really kind of bringing out, these are all experiences that people had had themselves. Do you want to take over?
Okay. All right. So what I'll do now is I'll talk a little bit about the kind of resistance that was provoked, because we found that, our fourth finding is that these sorts of hard-hitting immigration campaigns also ended up provoking new waves of activism. And there's a lot of anger and outrage that was expressed in response to the campaign. And some of this was expressed online, and some of this was expressed through street protests. And this also drew in a lot of people who hadn't really been involved in activism before. And one example of this was this protest that was was done in response to the van that was organized by Southall Black Sisters here. And some of this also crossed over into some online mobilization against Operation Centurion. And so these tweets here that you can see are from June 2014. And what happened here was that a group of activists basically disrupted a series of the raids which were on workplaces and were on homes. And what happened was that there were some leaked documents that showed that the raids, which were named Operation Centurion, were based actually on nationality and language, rather than any kind of intelligence about immigration violations. So this is again how led it to be perceived as racist, essentially. And but I think what's interesting here is it shows how kind of online activism and street activism can work together instead of being mutually exclusive. Because often in activist circles, people talk about, should we protest in the street or should we do things online? And this really shows how they work together. And as well, another thing that happened with that. With the Go Home van, you had, if you remember from the image of the van, there was a number that you could text to saying, I want to go home. And so what happened was a lot of people texted this number saying things like, I want to go home to Wilson Green, or can you please send me home to Scotland, and that sort of thing. Or maybe, East London should start a republic, and I'll go. But we found this is from the Home Office's report on Operation Vacant. They actually found that it's basically 2/3 of the text messages were sent were a hoax. So, which is interesting. There's also quite a lot of active debate on Twitter, with particularly using this hashtag racist van, and humor often played a kind of quite important role in this. And interestingly, the racist van hashtag is actually still in use today, even though it's been a couple of years ago. Another example of a new form of activism was this group called Britsits, which was a group that was set up in response to the rules on family migration, and in particular the income requirement, where if you're a British citizen and you want to bring your spouse to the UK, you've got to prove that you're earning at least £18,600 a year, which ends up excluding quite a few people. So this group called Britsits was set up to challenge this. Interestingly, it's an example of how sort of white British nationals primarily were involved in challenging immigration rules. And also, as well, some but not all of the activism has been migrant-led. And so, our fifth finding is that we identified some inequalities in terms of who was able to take part in political debate or in political protest, because people were worried that it would, threaten their residency status, because of if you think about, for example, attempts to, there have been moves, within the immigration rules to make it possible to revoke someone's citizenship. When you fill out those forms to apply for a visa, you've got to say you're not a terrorist and you're a person of good character and that sort of thing. And so it made a lot of people feel that they couldn't actually take part. And for example, this was activists we interviewed, and we found several instances of migrants, even people who did have regular status, being scared to be politically engaged because they thought it would threaten their status. And as well, we also noticed that alongside there was some fear that even sort of established minorities who didn't really have to worry about their immigration status were starting to feel that being politically outspoken was kind of too much of a risk to take. And this we found in the focus groups. We found people talked about being afraid of moving through public space or being harassed and that sort of thing. And people talked about fear of having their passport revoked. However, another thing that we found, this is our sixth finding, is that because we're starting to see new forms of racism, really, and new forms of hostility and discrimination, we found that often traditional anti-racist campaigns were having a hard time keeping up with some of these changes. For example, how do you deal with international students? How do you deal with asylum seekers? Where it's not strictly about skin color, but it may be about nationality, one's language, and so on, one's immigration status. And one of the most disturbing things that we found, this is from an interview that Sukwant did, is that we found there was a kind of internalization of anti-immigrant messaging within migrant communities, within established kind of ethnic minority communities, which we found kind of quite worrying. We also found that there were some local variations in how government campaigns were experienced and also the activism that was produced. So in places where there was more of a kind of existing infrastructure for activist organizing, it was much easier for migrants' rights organizations, asylum seekers organizations to get involved and to build a campaign. But in other places where there was less of that kind of history, often the work that was being done was really about service provision, was about particularly for vulnerable people, and often the most vulnerable. In a kind of a very difficult funding climate. So again, it was a kind of tendency to focus on kind of service provision. For example, we found that this is where the reactions varied across local areas. And this is a photo of a demonstration in Glasgow where there was quite a strong history of activism. And as well in Ealing and Hounslow, for organizations like Southall Black Sisters, there are quite a few networks of migrant campaigners and charities who could organize very, very quickly in response to, for example, in the case of Glasgow, the posters in the reporting centres, or having street demonstrations and that kind of thing. And also in the Scottish context, there was a lot of lobbying and sort of trying to ask questions within the Scottish Parliament. So that's an example of where there kind of was an existing infrastructure of migrants' rights and anti-racist campaigning. It was very easy to mobilize quickly and also to build on this. However, another issue that we found was that there wasn't always a sense of solidarity being among people who are targeted by the anti-immigration campaigns, and that was one of the significant challenges that we noticed. For example, we in the focus groups, we often noticed hostility being expressed between different groups of migrants. And it was often based around an idea that my group is a deserving group. Those are the people who are undeserving, for example. So that was something, it was quite disturbing finding, and also something that's, I think, a significant challenge for campaigns. And for example, if you can see this sort of, this is one of the focus group participants in Ealing and Hounslow, which Sukwant had done. And so this person's talking about, he's saying, there's so many people, why are you supporting them? They have to go home. And I was shocked, my community hate me so much, so what can I expect from British people? So of course, if they're going to be racist with me, they're going to hate me, so it's impacting my community. So this is really an example of how you see these sorts of community tensions and sort of hostilities sort of within migrant communities and towards other migrant communities. As well, we noticed that people actually reported being harassed for being perceived to be illegal immigrants, even when they actually had British citizenship, or they even had, or they had a settled immigration status. And that's because the different legal statuses between migrants can often be quite confusing. And if you think about how the media talks about it, when politicians talk about cracking down on immigration, and then they'll talk about reducing numbers at the same time. So it's easy to really conflate legal and illegal, and often with the lead to perceptions that sort of all immigration is illegal, basically. And so it's very difficult to distinguish between asylum seekers, refugees, students, workers, residents, and sometimes ethnic minority British people. And so we found that people found harassed for being illegal immigrants when they actually had settled status. And one of the interviews that Hannah did in Bradford showed that. So this came up with this quite disturbing quote where so they're talking about someone who is third generation, which means their grandparents would have been in the UK, and they're asking, are we going to be allowed to stay? So it's leading to people feeling that they're basically being told they have no right to be in the country. And then, we also found that many people would come to the UK because of the ideals that are promoted as British values, such as, for example, such as liberty, such as mutual respect, such as tolerance for people with different faiths and beliefs. But when they came to the UK, they were treated in a way that actually made them question the existence of these sorts of values. Here's an example of some the focus groups participants in Bradford, which Hannah conducted. And this one person says, we thought it was a welcoming country, somewhere you can go for safety. And someone else says, I can't go because I don't have a home. We were told that people would come to the UK from countries like Afghanistan because they thought it was welcoming. But then what's happening is that the increased fear caused by the kind of get tough rhetoric from the government, really was making Britain feel as though it wasn't really a safe or welcoming country. And even many people who we spoke with wish they could go home, but for example, the second quote, this person is from Sudan, and they felt that if they went home, they'd actually be killed. So I think that's it. So that sort of gives you an overview of the kind of findings of our project.
62 suspected immigration offenders arrested. There were studies of local areas where people protested. You can't believe government statistics on immigration. Their campaign is to cause anxiety within the nation. The debating was so intense as we all tried to make some sense of the mapping in